Hello, hello, and welcome once again to another episode of Found in Interpretation podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Alain Breton, again this week, and I'm also with my co-host Brian Bickford. How you doing, Brian?
Hey, not too bad. And we're also here with Ahmed El Khamloussy, and he is coming to us from The Hague.
Yes, exactly. So just before Ahmed, we start. For everyone to be on the same page, I'm going to introduce you to our audience. So Ahmed began his linguistic career in Morocco, where he studied English and American literature and Arabic English translation. He holds a master's in translation and a graduate diploma in conference interpreting from the University of Ottawa. He has interpreted for the Canadian Parliament, served as the Arabic interpreter for Canadian prime ministers, and since 2010, he has been with the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So, if you'd like to know more, well, just listen to the rest of this podcast. So,
Yes. So
Indeed.
maybe I can start things off with a quick question. Maybe the easiest one is, how do you become an interpreter for the International Criminal Court?
Well, well, first of all, thank you for having me on your podcast, and congratulations on this great initiative. Really, the world of interpreting is always looking for people like you who, beyond being good interpreters, are also interested in promoting this profession, which has been great to me, at least. Um, Before I answer your questions in the plural, allow me just to say that although I am a staff interpreter at the International Criminal Court, I'm not appearing as a representative of the court. So I'm appearing on my own behalf, and whatever I say is only my own opinions. It doesn't commit the court to anything. How do you become an interpreter at the ICC? It's been a long process. For myself, it all started at the University of Ottawa, where I studied conference interpreting. And then I was hired by the Canadian government, the federal government. I worked as a parliamentary interpreter for over 10 years, close to 12 actually. And at one point in my career, I started teaching at the University of Ottawa in 2006. I started. And just looking at material to use with students, I happened to come across some material from the International Criminal Court. It was still in its early stages, and I thought, this is interesting. To be honest with you, out of curiosity, I applied. I didn't think it would work, and it was rather fast. The process was fast. They called me for a test, a technical test, interpreting test, and an interview, and then I was offered the job. And it's been
did you
a
see an
very
opening for
interesting
an
journey.
application, or you just applied just like
Yeah.
that?
No, it wasn't just a cold application. It was I was responding to a vacancy announcement. They were looking for a French booth interpreter, so I applied. And yeah, as I said, they called me in. I took the test, did the interview, and was hired.
It was hard, and you're hired. Wow, awesome!
Yeah, it
And
was
and
amazing. Yeah.
and you've had so many experiences since then. You've had trials for very infamous people.
Yes, I've been privileged in the sense that because the court is relatively young institution, I've been on every single trial since the court started holding trials. So I've experienced all of them. The very first
Wow.
ones were from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and I moved on to the Bemba case, which was in the Central African Republic. Then moved on. There were some other hearings and trials. Well, not really trials, just proceedings. They never actually turned into trials. From Rwanda, from the Darfur, currently working on the Darfur case, and also Central African Republic, but a different. There are basically two camps. We had the first camp and then the second camp. And yeah, I've been privileged to do all of them. And in addition to just because people, when you think of the International Criminal Court, you think, okay, well, it's judicial interpretation. It is for the most part. When it's hearings, it's judicial. But we also do side events and diplomatic events and many other things. It can be high-level diplomatic meetings for the presidency or the prosecutor and the Assembly of States parties. It varies a lot.
Okay. And I'm just wondering, like it's great that we're doing it on November 11th, Remembrance Day in Canada, because
Indeed.
we're all like we're remembering people who have given their lives and made the ultimate sacrifice, and we're here talking about you in an environment where you're dealing with war crimes and genocide. And are there any cases in particular where you're like, just I can't, this is too much for me because of what you're hearing and just the crimes that were committed and whatnot?
That is a very, very important question. I'm often asked about vicarious trauma, for example, secondary trauma. How do you deal with that as an interpreter? How do you live it? There are basically two types of interpreters or of approaches to that. Mine has been a very basic one. When I started working at the court, my kids were very young, and I would sit there and listen to a witness talk about what happened to their kids. And I'm always reminded of interestingly enough, I think it's from the Bible. There, but for the grace of God goes I. I feel privileged that I'm not in their position, but I'm also privileged in that I can be their voice. I'm thinking of a victim, of a witness, for example, who underwent horrendous events and experiences. And to be privileged to carry their voice to the judges and to prosecutors and defense teams, to me, it is a tremendous responsibility, but also a privilege, really. So I found that helps me a lot. If you think of it only as a job, it can be difficult to deal with. If you think of it as more than just a job, you're also the human, and that's why I always say that no matter how advanced AI gets, there are still some jobs that require human intervention, human emotion. I was reminded of that when I was watching your podcast with Mr. Jolicoeur, I think his name is, from Laval, when he said that Matthew from the Translation Bureau told him about the story of how do you use AI to interpret the haranguing and and the hustle and bustle of the question period, for example. So the human side has to play a role there. You're constantly reminded of why you're doing what you're doing. But we were also privileged in that a former chief of section of language section, before one of the major trials started back in maybe 2000 and I want to say 11 or 12, she knew that the content was going to be very tough to deal with. So she set up a group headed by a therapist specialized in trauma and things like that to just evacuate. If you need to talk, to find coping mechanism and whatnot.
Before this initiative, it wasn't already set up?
Well, there is the staff psychologist on hand. If you need to go speak to them, you can. But this one was specifically for the group of interpreters assigned to that trial. So it was very specific, and it was a great initiative, to be honest. It was helpful. At least you know that it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Mind you, having said that, I am a French booth interpreter, for example. So I have an extra filter when you have a witness who's speaking what we call at the court a situation language, which is one of those languages of lesser diffusion, say in Darfur, the Fur language. They take the brunt of the testimony, the Fur interpreters, and then they render it into Arabic, which then I take it in relay. So I am filtered from that shock, the initial trauma, and also I'm not from that country, I'm not from that community. So when the witness speaks, I'm human, I can feel it, I can empathize, but it's not somebody who looks like me, who talks like me, and who's from my community. So a lot of those interpreters are also from the affected communities. So the trauma is stronger for them.
Oh yeah, I can imagine. Absolutely.
So you don't do Arabic, although Arabic is one of your work languages, you don't do Arabic at the court.
I do mostly Arabic into French. Because I was hired as a French booth, I specialize in interpreting from English into French, but also from Arabic. There are trials that required Arabic, and I did that. When I first started at the court, we didn't have an actual Arabic interpreter, so I did do some assignments, mostly consecutive interpretation. Then, when we actually had, by the time we had an actual trial requiring Arabic as one of the working languages, then we hired a booth. And one of the current staff members of that team is actually a Glendon graduate. Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
Nobody from my year, I think. No, I don't think so.
I don't know that. I don't know. I don't remember actually if he was in the same year or not. Yeah.
Now, I noticed on that there are several official languages for the ICC. Now, are there booths for each corresponding language? Like, are you working with colleagues in other languages?
Yeah. So just to make it very clear, the language regime at the court is specific. We have two working languages, English and French, which means that anybody who is in the courtroom can speak either language. They can argue and debate in those languages, French and English. Then we have the official languages of the court, which are the UN 6 official languages, obviously, including Arabic and Spanish and Russian. Then we have what we call the other category of languages, situation languages. So a situation is any country where the court has an interest. They started an investigation, or they're looking into not cases, but just the situation. I'll give you an example. The recent Palestine Israel is a situation because there's not a specific thing happening. For now, it's just a situation. So you would have a situation language. In Darfur, you had Zagawa, you had Fur. Those are two languages that we actually used in the courtroom, and one of them is still being used. Then we have individual booths for those languages. So I'm in the French booth, then next to me, there's usually the Fur booth, because I actually trained them, so they feel more comfortable when I'm sitting next to them, and we can help each other during the break, or if there are things that we don't understand. So, and then we used to have a Swahili booth. Now we don't have Swahili. So we have two Sango booths, actually. Sango is one of the languages spoken in the Central African Republic. We also had Acholi, which is a language spoken in Uganda. That's for the Lord's Resistance Army, if you're familiar with the name Joseph Kony. His number 2 was at the court, and he was tried and convicted. So for each case, you would have the languages that establish at the beginning of the trial. The judges decide with the parties what language. But one of the driving elements in this is the accused themselves. The accused person chooses the language they want to be tried in, that they understand, or because of the provisions of the Rome Statute, which is our governing treaty.
Okay. And is it how do you find interpreters in those languages?
That's the $1 million question. So for some languages, it is very, very difficult. You can certainly appreciate the difficulty to let somebody know that we need interpreters in those languages. There are some other considerations beyond linguistic.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't want to lose the surprise effect, because you want to charge somebody and the warrant of arrest is still under seal, nobody has to know about it. So how do you advertise for a position requiring, say, the Fur language, but you don't want to alert them that there is something brewing?
Mm-hmm.
So now that's one consideration. Another consideration is, I don't know, to my knowledge, there's no conference interpreting masters in for English or for Arabic, or there are none. So what you end up doing is looking in the diaspora as much as possible, those who are refugees or asylum seekers in Europe or elsewhere in the world. So you try to reach out to them. And then you also, for some cases, you can advertise by being very generic. And usually what you get is somebody who doesn't have necessarily the background in interpreting or languages even. What they have is a knowledge of the community and their mother tongue. In this case, for example, Fur. But we know that they are also Sudanese. Even if it's Darfur, they're Sudanese. So even if they're not Arab, the official language is Arabic. So they speak Arabic. So you, as an Arabic speaker and a trainer, I set up the tests, and even the tests have to be set up in a way that actually works, because it's complicated. I would rather not talk about the details of it.
Of course.
But yeah, but then when you get them, you have to train them. And so Arabic is the common language we have between us, and we would focus on consecutive interpretation, and then you move on to simultaneous if time allows. And yeah.
So you have to juggle between consecutive and simultaneous in the courtroom, or do you also have to do it like on the side? Because you said you do some diplomatic functions as well.
Yeah. In the booth, for the working languages, it's almost only simultaneous. When you're in the booth, it's always simultaneous interpretation. It's conference interpreting with some particular characteristics. For example, I can get into that maybe later if you want. But if you're assigned to a press conference, it can be simultaneous, but it can also be, if you're on mission, then it's consecutive. If you're also assisting during the what we call psychosocial assessment of or evaluation of a witness before they testify or after they testify, then you're interpreting for the witness and also for the psychologist. And that's usually done either in chuchoté or consecutive.
So
Yeah.
when you say you're on a mission, it means
Yeah.
that you're outside of The Hague. You are directly in a country, directly on the field. So the interpreter doesn't always stay in the booth. The interpreter is out there, from what I think I
Yeah.
understand.
That's correct. There have been times I haven't been on mission for a while outside the seat of the court, but there have been assignments, including when we were looking for interpreters for a language called Zagawa, which is spoken in Darfur. I had to go to some European countries where there's a large diaspora and to meet with them. But I've also had to go to Egypt for a mission, for example, and others have gone to other situation countries. Yes, you do actually go in the field sometimes, but most of
Now,
the work is done in the booth
oh,
here.
okay. Now, are there? Because I also saw that there are also other locations in around Africa, mostly, where there are courts as well. Do you have to go to those as well, or are you mostly like headquartered in The Hague? And
Yeah. So, for example, in the Central African Republic, there's a special criminal court that's only for Central African Republic and for people there. We don't go there. We don't work there. There may be some cooperation between the two courts, but it's an independent court.
okay,
So, if we go on a mission, we go with somebody usually. You would go with a representative of the court or a team, and then you can interpret there. Otherwise, there are country offices or field offices, they used to be called, where you have staff but not interpreters. And when they require interpreters, usually they hire local interpreters. We call them field interpreters. Not necessarily trained in interpreting, but we do also have another unit within our section at the court where we do bring them in for a week and give them basic training in consecutive and note-taking and things like that. But those are field interpreters, not conference interpreters, not necessarily, they don't necessarily hold degrees in interpreting.
okay. And I noticed also, like a lot of the people that are either waiting trial or have been tried are mostly in Africa, in the Middle East. Are there any like particular reason? Is there a reason, or is there? Because I know there's like war crimes and genocide in other parts of the world. So I'm just,
Yeah.
it made me curious to think like, well, why are we concentrating on just one continent?
Yeah, that's a very, very valid and interesting question. I can only give you my opinion on this, but I can also quote the first chief prosecutor of the court, who used to say in response to this question, why are most or all detained individuals or accused persons from Africa? And he used to say, and where are the victims from? Also from Africa. But not just that, because there are other countries and parts of the world where things are. So what one needs to keep in mind is that the whole Rome Statute, that is the founding treaty upon which the court is built, is based on a principle called complementarity. And the court only intervenes in cases where the country doesn't have the capacity because of civil war or whatever, because their system is no longer able to sustain a trial or proceedings, or the willingness. And the willingness can be political, can be other things, but that's not our call. That's the chief prosecutor and the judges, because they also have to approve the request for investigations and all that. So those are two main. The complementarity is based on those two pillars: the capacity and the willingness to prosecute. So it's very difficult to see, for example, how you can go into a Western country, which is a democracy, with a proper functioning judicial, and say, we're taking this individual. There might be the other element of willingness, but so that's where it gets a little bit difficult. But that's not our call. That's the call of the chief prosecutor, based on a number of and also the interest of justice and a number of principles. Yeah.
Wow. Wasn't there, and my memory is a bit fuzzy on this, but wasn't there an attempt years ago to bring, let's say, George W. Bush or Dick Cheney or Rumsfeld to the court for the war in Iraq?
As far as I know, no. That's what I heard, just like you, in the media. That's what was being debated and also promoted by some individuals or activists or human rights activists. But to my knowledge, the court had no jurisdiction over. We don't have jurisdiction over the U.S., for example, because it's again, first of all, it's not a states party, so they did not sign or ratify the treaty. And second of all, you don't go into a democracy with a functioning judicial and say, okay, we're taking your boss and trying to, however, there is the case of al-Bashir, who is the former president of Sudan, who's wanted for, among other things, for genocide and war crimes against the people of Darfur. He's still at large, but there is a case called the prosecutor versus Omar al-Bashir, and he was the president. And it's a bit complicated because the warrant of arrest had been issued, and states are, especially states parties, are have to cooperate and hand him over. And he transited via South Africa at one point when he was still president, and he was not handed over to the court. So that creates certain issues for the courts.
I just mentioned now the war in Iraq. I think you have a story about that that you told us once in class when at Glendon, right?
Yeah. Yes. Do
you mind sharing it?
I didn't start the war. No, I do have. Yeah, I do have a little bit of a story about it. In 2003, literally 3 days before the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Saddam Hussein gave an interview to a former British MP and journalist, Tony Benn. And it was the first interview that he gave to a Western media since the first Gulf War, the very first one. So it was a big deal. And I remember working on Parliament Hill back then. I was still in Canada. And at one point, it was very interesting because it was my very first televised assignment. So I was very nervous. And we used to have a chief interpreter who was always in her office. And the office was a few, maybe 500 meters away from the actual hill. But she was always watching TV and following what was happening. And then all of a sudden, I switch on the microphone. I start my shift as my turn as on a televised meeting. And then I look to my side, and through the window, I see my chief interpreter gesturing to me, come here. I thought maybe I don't know, maybe I messed up.
Yeah.
So I come out and said, okay, well, News World, the cable news outlet, they just got a copy of the interview and they would like you to go interpret live. So I rushed across the street. It was just across the street where the Bank of Montreal building, the old one, was just across the street.
A
Yeah.
150-year-old building.
So I rush there. There's that building, and I go in and I sit. And the moment I sit down, there was a screen, and they give me a headset, not even the proper interpreting headset. And they said, "We're going live." They just got a copy in Toronto, and we're going live with it. And I had to interpret that whole interview with Tony Benn, where it was all about the UNSCOM, the UN mission, and how Hans Blix couldn't find any weapons of mass destruction. And it was a huge, huge deal because, yeah, it was a very. And the other thing is, I had to interpret from Arabic into English, which is not my booth, to be honest. I mean, I do manage, but it's not my forte.
Which TV channel was it on for the CBC?
Yeah,
No,
News World is the 24-hour. It's
Okay,
RFI
okay.
for Radio Canada, for example. It's the 24-hour news channel. Yeah, News
so
World.
everybody's watching 3 days after.
Yeah, no, it was very nerve-wracking, but it was fantastic. But unfortunately, you know how the story ended. So I always say, to preface my statement, I did not start the war. It wasn't because of me. Yeah, can you imagine?
Oh yes.
The
Well,
weapons were lost in translation.
Exactly. That's
that's
it.
right.
Yeah.
Never to be found again.
Yeah. No, that was a memorable moment for me in my career. Yeah.
So when you did apply at the Hague, do you mention those events, to sort of promote what you did, or was it just a parliamentary experience that got you up there? Because basically, it seemed that
Mm.
you sort of climb up the ladder in a certain way. You started at University of Ottawa, you went to the Parliament, then the Hague.
Mm.
Could you have leaped forward directly to The Hague, depending on your experience, or was it really the process that led you there?
I honestly cannot tell you that it is the journey that every interpreter who works with me now at the court followed. When I joined the ICC, most of my colleagues, at least one, two, three, at least three, if not more, had experience with the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, for example, the Arusha one. We also had colleagues from the ICTY, which is for former Yugoslavia. Also, it was based here in The Hague as well. So they did have that experience, judicial court justice and all that. Myself, you asked if I mentioned it. I must have mentioned some of the things, the highlights, if you want to call them, in my CV, and maybe during the interview. For example, I also one of the things I was proud of, and it was the G8. That year, it was Russia plus the G7. I was fortunate enough to interpret at the G7 plus one in Kananaskis. It was held in Canada, in Alberta, and I went and did that. So that was an interesting highlight, if you want, that I mentioned during the interview. But to be honest, that's why I always tell people, be a good interpreter, do your best, and apply. And you never know. Because for my interview, for example, I did the test. It wasn't brilliant because I didn't have experience in that. It was okay. I learned later on. But the interview, during the interview, the person who was the chief of the section back then was part of the panel, and she asked me, just out of curiosity, what book are you reading these days? And I just happened to pick up a book when I was in at the Montreal airport, about to board to go to The Hague and do the test, and it was called The Translator,
Oh, I've read that.
and
Yeah.
and it was about a Zagawa interpreter. And I couldn't believe. I mean, when she said, and I said, The Translator, she said, what is it about? I said, well, it's about this Zagawa interpreter. And she couldn't believe it. She said, we're looking for Zagawa interpreters and we need somebody to train them. I said, well, lucky for me, I also did some training at Ottawa U. And I think that helps. So it can be something else in your, just like I always tell trainees or students, when you get to you make that decision to do the master's in conference interpreting, but you're not a clean slate. You come in with your background, your knowledge, things that I don't know. I mean, I may have been an interpreter longer than you, but we all have knowledge that we picked up over the years, and you have interests, and you're passionate about this field or that field. So you use all of that, and all of that contributes to making you the better interpreter that you would like to be. I've always loved Steve Jobs' commencement speech from 2008 or 7, I'm not sure of the date now, called Connecting the Dots. How, when you look back, you think, well, this made sense. I went to Ottawa and I did this and I did that. But when you're doing those things, you have no idea. I mean, except for maybe the fortunate ones or the few ones. But you don't know exactly where you're going to end up. I never thought I would end up here, but now I'm here. I may go back somewhere else. I don't know that. All I know is that if you can enjoy what you're doing and also keep working hard at it, I mean, it's not... I always say that there's talent, but there's also hard work. Because if it was just talent, then we wouldn't have a school for it. You just say, well, sorry, you weren't born with it. So yeah, it just... everything contributes to making you who you are and where you are.
Now, we all met in one way or another in different years at Glendon College. Are you still teaching there? And do you still teach at Ottawa U, or...?
No, Ottawa, it's been a while. Ottawa, since I left because it was also with the federal government. Glendon, I still collaborate with them. Yeah, I still... during a certain period of time, it was mostly Arabic, English, Arabic, and then we added French, and that's how I met you both, and also some new colleagues. And it's, as I mentioned, one of my colleagues now in the Arabic booth is a former student at Glendon. It's fantastic. And when people ask me, I always meant it. When I start the year, I always say I'm not teaching young kids. I'm not teaching. We are all in this together. It's your training. Just let me help you get to where you want to be. Maybe using my experience and the pitfalls that I learned to overcome. And the biggest achievement or the biggest source of gratification for me is to sit in a booth Sunday and say, I'm working with Alain, I'm working with Brian, I'm working with Mahmoud. It's fantastic. It really is. To me, that's the best compliment you can get.
What makes I'm sure that some of your former students or current ones will be listening to this broadcast, but having met so many students over the years, either at Ottawa or at Glendon, what's the defining quality of an interpreter? Would you say what makes a good interpreter?
It's
The $1 million question.
Yeah, it's a
Well, that's
$2
why I'm
million
asking it.
question, this one. Yeah. Again, it's just one man's opinion, but I think that based on what I've seen over the years, and I'm not excluding myself from the lot, I'm still in it because it's a continuous process. Before I answer, I always like to go back. Before I answer, I don't know if you remember, I've mentioned this, but I mentioned it a lot. You meet somebody in life, man, woman, whoever, whatever your choice, and you have this partner, and they may be from the same country, the same city, the same religion, the same everything, same references, cultural and otherwise. And how many times do you find yourself in a situation where you say, oh, sorry, I thought you meant something else. Oh, is that what you mean? Or I didn't mean it that way. So now try to imagine different country, different background, different religion, different field, different accent. Everything is completely different. And you're sitting there and listening to them and trying to make sense of what they're saying. So that, to me, is the beginning of the learning process. Once you realize that, okay, well, I'm never going to be perfect. That's not part of my vocabulary. I always say in French, perfectionnement, not perfection, because it's a continuous process, professional development, and you're trying to hone your skills. So continuous, but I also believe in structured approach, where you have certain rituals, I call them. On a daily basis, you watch the news, you read, you listen to watch or read editorials. You have to be really curious about what's going on in your country, but also in the world. Then you also have to force yourself. For example, if you know there's going to be this huge deal in Quebec, for example, the whole electric batteries and things. you read up about it. I don't want to mention the name of companies. So you force yourself, even if you're, I'm not particularly inclined to read that stuff. Well, I will read about it, and I will try to find out more about it. What makes a good electric car good? Why is there an issue with the electric batteries? What's the environmental impact? And you keep digging and digging and digging. The danger sometimes in, for example, me working at the International Criminal Court is, and I mentioned earlier that we have a specific type of interpreting. It is conference interpreting, but at the same time, you have to deal with things you don't deal with when you're at a conference. If you're interpreting at a medical conference, most speakers are doctors or in practitioners in that field. If you're in the courtroom, you have let's say, a British judge who has a British accent, common law tradition, and who speaks in a certain way. Usually you say to people, can I do something? Well, in the courtroom, well, if it pleases the court, or leave is granted to do this and that. So there's that terminology, first of all. And the register tends to be very high. They're very educated people, very eloquent usually. And in the same courtroom, you have a prosecutor prosecutor, let's just call it prosecutor, who may be American or Canadian, so the accent is completely different. Then you have, on the opposing side, you have a defense counsel who may be British, or maybe Australian, or maybe African, or maybe French. And all of a sudden it's civil law, it's not common law. So even the way you phrase things is different. Then you have a witness who has almost no education. So when they speak, register has to go to their level. It's not demeaning, but it's just you have to be faithful to register as well. So at the same time, you're dealing with all those issues, and then you have the subject matter. So you prepare, you have a witness statement, you read it ahead of time. This witness is coming to tell us about an attack. So you have to know the weapons they use, you have to know how they build their houses, if it's a hut or if it's something else, what are the materials used. Then all of a sudden, as they're telling a story and you're prepared for that story, an objection. There's an objection that's raised. Well, the objection is going to be high level legalese. So all of a sudden you're switching your gears and thinking, okay, now I have to, and it's usually fast, and you have to be quick on your feet. So it keeps you on your toes. When the witness is speaking, then let's assume they're speaking in English. You have to be as close to them as possible, without being literal, but you have to be as close as possible. When there's a legal debate, then you put on your conference interpreting hat, where you take a little bit more liberty with the way you phrase things and the way you rearrange the sentence. So it is a constant, not battle, but constant challenge in a positive way.
While you're saying that, you're kind of making the case, like you mentioned a bit earlier, and Louis a few weeks ago, that AI won't be able to, unless it really understands what's going on, it won't be able to discern if we're talking in a familiar way or a more professional way or anything in between.
I never like to say never, so I won't say that it will never reach that stage. But as it is currently, and if I'm projecting myself maybe in the midterm, I don't see how AI can be applied, if only for confidentiality reasons, and also because there's also the whole issue of the bias in algorithms themselves. And we don't pay attention to that. We just assume, well, AI, it's neutral. Well, it's not. Nothing is neutral. So as it stands, I don't see how it could be applied in the courtroom. It can be applied around the courtroom. I'll give you an example. When the investigators of the prosecutor, of the office of the prosecutor, go in the field, they can gather thousands of pages and thousands. I mean, the volumes are absolutely stunning. It would make sense, for example, for that type of material to be filtered through AI, because you're only looking for one paragraph. You're not looking for 1,000 pages. So imagine sending that to translation and waiting for whatever time it takes to have it ready. So there are certain activities, and I'm not opposed to that. I'm reminded actually of somebody whose name escapes me now, but one of the the big names in the history of interpretation who used to say, the only thing that will replace an interpreter is not technology. It's an interpreter who uses technology. And I tend to agree with that statement because it makes no sense to just say, well, it's never going to happen. No, it will not happen in certain areas. You have a witness who doesn't respect the proper grammar, for example, and who doesn't speak properly, does not enunciate, or you have not just witnesses, it can be anyone else. So that sort of militates against this idea that we will be replaced immediately.
Yeah.
So that's my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree because, like, I think, well, AI and it's kind of like a baby, but like in both ways. Whereas, like, it's a very new technology in the history of IT and whatnot, but also it's a baby in the sense that you have to teach it everything. It's not just an intuitive program that's just going to do anything that you ask it to. You have to teach it to do these things, and to try to teach register and jargon and emotion and empathy. Like, there's just so many different aspects of your job in particular, dealing with war crimes, that, like, I don't see how AI would help, other than, like you said, like siphoning through some information so that you can make your job can be easier in the long run, because it's looking for the information in a much quicker way than what you would if you had to do it manually.
Yeah, and even using that, I mean, we can't, for example, at the court, we do have safeguards, because you can't just put highly confidential information into public AI, ChatGPT, or any other name. So even to use that, you have to have a proprietary software or AI module that allows you to use it, but not stock information and no generative function there, because you don't want it to be outside the realm of the court. Because within the court, as interpreters, we're privy to a lot of confidential information that even lawyers do not get to see. For example, I'll give you an example of something that happens regularly. You have the judge, and then you have the two parties, the prosecution and the defense. But there are times that something can be filed ex parte, meaning excluding one of the two parties. So the judges will see it, the party that actually filed will see it, and interpreters will see it, but no one else. So you have to be extremely, extremely careful what information you disclose and how you use it. And so it is very, very well safeguarded.
Wow.
So it's a bit of a warning as well to for us interpreters. Let's say before a conference, we receive several documents. They might be confidential. The first thing to do, maybe it's not necessarily to send them all to a ChatGPT or any other platform, because we might be unawarely breaching confidentiality for our own clients.
Absolutely, that's a very, very important warning, if you want, because it is confidential, and because if it is generative, it means that it's captures whatever you're giving them, and they use it also for their database. And all of a sudden, a name or a keyword pops up, and then it puts some other party in on a different track. Just so you know, for example, that this is the real world we're living in. I can mention it because it was public. The court suffered a huge cyber attack last year, where I can't tell you what was compromised, but clearly it's dangerous because you have names of witnesses, names of individuals who are protected, and you can't have that information outside the realm of the court. So using AI, well, you would expose yourself to even greater danger. Then there's the liability. Who's liable? The interpreter, or the one who provided the document, or the one who used the information? This is something that's still being worked on. I'm currently working with, we just decided to set up a working group within our section to discuss this issue, including on testing, for example. If you're testing an interpreter for a job, can they use AI? Can they just use voice recognition and then click on a button and translate, and all of a sudden everything has been translated?
Wow. Now, moving on to maybe one last final point, because we are approaching the end of the podcast. Like, I am absolutely in awe of everything that you've done in your career, in your professional life. Like, I very much
Thank
admire
you.
you. You're one of my, yeah, I've listened to you interpret, and like, yeah, you're one of the best. So,
Thank you so much.
as a,
It's very kind of you.
but as
He
maybe
doesn't have to give you grade. He doesn't have to
no,
give
I
you
know.
grades
I'm
anymore.
not a student anymore. I don't have to say
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
So,
No.
but
Yeah.
is there something else that you may like that you're missing in your career that you feel that maybe you want to try to delve into and maybe complete your career? Do you want to stay in the International Criminal Court?
I mean, ideally, I think I can't say for sure, but ideally, I would like to end my career in the teaching field. I like training people. I've had the pleasure of meeting so many interesting people, and I've done some training that I've always cherished, and I will always cherish for the International Committee for the Red Cross of the Red Cross in the UK, in Russia, and you just meet new people, fascinating things, and you keep learning. One of the things I do when I'm training is I have an idea of what the topic will be. I have an idea of what the techniques I'd like to work on are, but I also like to challenge myself. So I don't go look up terminology and ways of phrasing things. I always put myself on an equal footing with whoever I have the pleasure of training. And then you see for yourself, you say, okay, well, if with all my experience I'm finding it difficult, chances are they will find it difficult as well. And also to demystify. I mean, I love this profession. I think it's amazing, but it's also human. And it's that part of it that I love. And we need to also remind others who are passionate and have the talent and the skills that it's all possible. It is possible. You can do whatever you want with it, but just keep working hard and keep enjoying it as well. This is not something we focus enough on during training. Enjoy it. It's really fun. The language is a challenge, and it's fun when you come up with the right word, the right expression. So, yeah.
Pat yourself in the back for
You're absolutely. I mean,
when you
Thank you.
find the right word, you're like, yes.
you're absolutely right. This career, that the profession that we have as interpreters, is really fun, and that's why we call this podcast "Found in Interpretation," because we found our calling here.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Here.
All right. So on that note, thank you very much, Ahmed. It was really a pleasure talking to you today, Brian, as well, and everyone else. Well, this podcast is available, as you may see now, on YouTube, Spotify, pretty soon on every other platform. We'll be back again pretty soon for another episode. And don't forget to like and subscribe, like we hear all the time. All right, guys. Thank you very
Here.
much, and I'll see you all next
Thank you
time.
for having me. Oh, see you again.
Thanks, Alain. Thanks, Ahmed.
See you. Bye.